Let's just bring in our panellists. I mentioned earlier Bruce Hawker and Michael Kroger. We're going to take a look at this US gun control issue in a moment, but just to pick up on that asylum seeker issue, Michael Kroger, the three experts did say today, this is Michael Lestrange, Angus Houston and Paris Aristotle, that more time is needed for their plan to work. Do you buy that, or is it time to make judgment on this?
Oh, look, not really, David. The one plan we know which works was John Howard's plan. And Bob Carr and Labor are slowly moving towards that. You know, they're now returning people back to Sri Lanka. We heard Carr say 800 have been returned. Temporary protection visas and turning the boats around are the other two missing parts of the John Howard policy, which worked, and Labor are slowly and inexorably moving towards it. But does it need more time? Look, the more time that elapses, the more people die at sea. And that is the great tragedy of Labor's failure in this regard. And that's why they need to immediately move back to John Howard's policy, which everyone knows worked.
Bruce Hawker, we have seen some 9,000 people come since this new plan was put in place. Do you think it's working?
I think it's got a long way to go, David, and I think it will probably succeed if we can get some bipartisanship between the Labor and the Liberal Party over this issue. That means a regional solution, establishing proper protocols with Malaysia and moving from there, which is essentially what the Houston panel has asked for. And that hasn't happened, and so we continue to see boats coming, although it must be noted that many fewer boats are coming from Sri Lanka than previously. But I think it's going to be very difficult to stem this tide without a level of bipartisanship. That's what we had back in the 1970s when Malcolm Fraser was Prime Minister and Hayden and before him Gough Whitlam were opposition leaders. That's what we need now. And sadly, I don't think we're going to see it, because I think there is a lot of political opportunity and short-term benefit for the opposition in this.
Now, Bruce Hawker and Michael Kroger, I want to return to the issue of gun law reform in the United States. It was a powerful speech from President Obama in Newtown, Connecticut today, in front of that community clearly devastated by that mass shooting on Friday. Let me just play a little of what President Obama had to say, and really stepping up the case now for some reform when it comes to the right to own, particularly high-powered weapons.
Are we really prepared to say that we're powerless in the face of such carnage? That the politics are too hard? Are we prepared to say that such violence visited on our children year after year after year is somehow the price of our freedom?
Bruce Hawker, I don't think anyone or many in Australia doubt that there should be some gun law reform in the United States when you consider how frequent these sorts of incidents are. But what do you think realistically about the chances of success here?
I think the chances of real gun reform are very slim in the United States. President Clinton introduced bans on assault weapons in 1994. The upshot of that was that the Democrats lost a 50-year control of the House of Representatives, according to Bill Clinton in his autobiography. That shows the level to which this issue divides Americans and the power of the National Rifle Association. Mayor Bloomberg, by the way, has said today that if there aren't meaningful changes to the way in which they regulate guns, then in his term as president, 48,000 Americans will die from illegal guns in America, which is roughly equivalent to the number of Americans who died in the Vietnam War. That's the size of this problem, and yet I remain quite pessimistic about them achieving real change, because they still don't control the House of Representatives. It would require a huge sea change.
Michael, does this just break down party lines, you know, the pro and anti-gun lobby in the United States? What's at stake for President Obama if he does get serious about some reform here?
Well, a lot of it breaks down between North and South, and it's going to be a 10 to 15-year campaign to go from where they are now to a more sensible gun reform policy. Don't forget that John Howard, after the 1996 Port Arthur massacre, he started with a gun buyback. They had the national legislation which required all the states to agree, and they did, thankfully. But he had a national gun buyback that saw 630,000 weapons surrendered. So perhaps one of the first things that Obama could do is have a voluntary buyback of weapons, which obviously will cost the Treasury money, and in Australia they had a levy for that. But rather than force people to surrender weapons, rather than force changes to licensing rules and registration rules, which will be very difficult in America, you start with what's politically possible, and the politically possible thing to start with is a voluntary buyback, I think.
That's an interesting point, because they actually have done that in various cities around the United States with remarkable success. They've paid up to $75 for each weapon that's handed back in, and the number that they get back is massive. So I think it will require that sort of a graduated process, I suspect.
The time to do it is when the electorate's sense of the devastation wreaked by, you know, misuse of firearms is at its greatest. And that was in Australia after Port Arthur. In America, it's after this shocking tragedy. To announce something now,
you've got to
pick the timing on these things. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, look, we only have a few minutes left, but I do want to get your thoughts on what sort of what the highs and lows have been for this year, and what you expect, what you predict for the election year 2013. Bruce, first to you. It has been a quite remarkable year, and I know you've had some highs and lows in the early part of it with that leadership challenge as well.
Indeed. Look, I think the year has pretty much ended the way it started, you know, with, I think, a pretty unhappy electorate with the way in which politics is being conducted at the moment, probably from both sides. And I think it's really been reflected in the sorts of numbers we're seeing at the moment. And as I've said and written about recently, you know, I actually think that Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott are quite codependent in this regard, because there are two much more popular figures in their own parties who are standing on the sidelines, and that's just one of the weird things that has happened in this year. Having said that,
you reckon they'll both be there come election time?
Look, I suspect so, but you know, I'm probably not the best person to make predictions about these things. But I do think that, you know, the government has engaged in some very useful policy initiatives, and there are some very good ministers in the government, and you know, the National Disability Insurance Scheme is a good example of that. But it has tended to have been overshadowed by, you know, what I think has been a pretty unedifying you know, year in politics, probably brought on largely by the hung parliament.
Yeah, Michael, what about you? Your thoughts on 2012 as things draw to a close?
Well, I think the government's moving towards the hard government policy on you know, illegal boat arrivals, which as I said before, I think that's a positive step. Certainly tentative steps towards the NDIS has been a positive for our nation. Even Bruce Hawker announcing earlier in the year, David, that Julia Gillard shouldn't run for the leadership of the Labor Party, which everyone laughed at. But in retrospect, by the way, he'll be proved right. And the negatives for the year, you know, obviously those people killed at sea through paying people smugglers to come here, and the whole AWU, Bruce Wilson, Craig Thompson ongoing scandal obviously is a very bad one for the government.
All right, well, I'm sure there'll be plenty more discussion about all of those things in 2013, and not forgetting the surplus and the government's efforts to try and keep the budget in the black, one of the first challenges it will face in the new year. But Michael Kroger, Bruce Hawker, thank you both for that and all your contributions through the year. Wish you both a Merry Christmas and look forward to getting stuck into it again in 2013 election year. Thanks very much for that.
Pleasure. And to you, David.
We're out of time for today's program. We'll be back same time tomorrow, though. Stay with us after the break, the very latest Sky News.
What is luxury?